passed by a burning magnesium wire, accompanied by a deafening noise. And in this brief light the figures of several men, weirdly illuminated, in the attitudes induced by the terror of certain death, and you will get a faint impression of what I saw. Then suddenly everything fell back into darkness, a darkness that seemed more intense than before after the glare of the explosion. I dimly discerned bodies on the ground and shadows bending over them. I did not stop, but I heard the voice of the Major calmly giving orders. "Pick him up, gently." But the wounded man shrieked, refusing to allow himself to be touched. His limbs, no doubt, were shattered. No matter. Forward. Forward. We rushed on towards the wood, where we hoped to get some protection from the avalanche of shells. A voice called out names behind me. "Corporal David killed. Sergeant Floss wounded. Leg broken." My men were running forward so impetuously that presently they were on a level with me. What fine fellows! I half regretted that some hostile troop was not waiting for us ambushed in the wood. We might have had a splendid fight. But would there have been a fight at all? Would the Prussians have ventured to measure themselves against these daredevils whom danger excites instead of depressing? Well, we were at the edge of the wood at last, waiting till the Major came up with us. Leaning against the trees, my chasseurs took breath after their race. I passed swiftly along the line to make sure that all my men were safe. They were all there, and I was relieved to find that I had no losses to deplore. The joys and sorrows of war had forged a bond between us that nothing could break. I had soon learnt to know each one of them, with his virtues and his faults, and I felt them to be without exception worthy fellows and brave soldiers. Each time death struck down one of them, I suffered as at the loss of a beloved brother, and I believe they repaid my affection for them by perfect trust. The Major had now rejoined us. We were not to lose a moment in responding to our Colonel's summons, and we were to remember that our comrades of the 2nd Squadron were bearing the brunt of the enemy's attack alone. "Forward!" We resumed our headlong advance. It was more difficult in the darkness of the wood than at the soft earth of the fields. We stumbled over roots and got entangled in brambles. Men fell, picked themselves up again, and went on with an oath. There was no more chaff. All minds were strung up to fever pitch, and the strength was giving out, while the storm of shrapnel continued overhead, cropping the branches and lighting up the tangle of leafless trees and bushes at intervals with its fireworks. Suddenly I heard on my right, not far behind me, screams and calls for help. Rising above the turmoil of battle, I saw my men stop for a moment, looking round, but they hurried on again at my orders without a word. "Forward!" Time was precious. Every minute might be fatal to our brothers in arms. We could now hear the familiar sound of our cavalry carbines quite close to us. We were approaching the trenches where the 2nd Squadron was making its heroic stand. "Forward! Forward!" We were all breathless from our frantic rush, but no one thought of slacking speed. I turned round to some one who was trotting behind me. It was my non-commissioned officer. Without a moment's loss of time he had to run to see what had caused the cries we had heard, and now he had come back at the double to report to me. "Sir, in the 3rd Troop, Sergeant Lagaraldi." "Well?" "He's killed, and Corporal Durand too." "Ah, and there are many wounded." I made no answer. Oh, it was horrible. 2 poor fellows so full of life and spirits not an hour ago. In spite of myself I could not help thinking for a few minutes of the 2 shattered, quivering bodies lying among the grasses of the forest. But I thrust away the gruesome vision resolutely. We could only think of doing our duty at this supreme moment. Later we would remember the dead, weep for them, and pray for them. The darkness was no longer so dense. The tangle of trees in front of us was less thick. The branches seemed to be opening out. We were near the edge of the wood. And at the same time, in spite of the mad beating of my heart and the buzzing in my ears, I was conscious that the cannonade had ceased, at least in our direction, and that the bullets were no longer coming so thickly. The German attack was probably relaxing. There was to be a respite. So much the better. It would enable us to pass from the wood to the trenches without much danger, thanks to the darkness. We had arrived. One by one our men slipped into the communication trench. What a sense of well-being and of rest we all had. The little passage in the earth, so uninviting as a rule, seemed to us as desirable as the most sumptuous palace. We drew breath at last. We felt almost safe, but still there was no time to be lost. While the Major hurried off to take the Colonel's orders, I climbed up on the parapet. Night had now fallen completely, but the moon was rising. Indeed, it would have been almost as light as day but for a slight mist which was spreading a diaphanous veil before our eyes. In the foreground to the right I could barely guess the dim outline of the battered mill and of the Brunt farm flanking the trench occupied by the foot chasseurs. Further off, however, I could vaguely distinguish the rows of trees that marked the first line of German trenches, about 250 yards away from us. To the left the mist had a reddish tinge. No doubt yet another house was burning in the unhappy village of Bixschoote. There was a sudden silence in this little corner of the great battlefield, as if our arrival in the firing line had been a prearranged signal. On our right, too, the intensity of the fire upon the trenches occupied by the Territorials diminished. To the left, on the other hand, the gunfire and rifle fire were incessant in the direction of the bridge of Steenstraat, defended by the brigade of mounted chasseurs. It seemed evident that the Germans, having failed in their attempt to cross the Yser Canal near us, were making a fresh effort towards the north. However, it is not safe to rely too absolutely even upon the most logical deductions, for very often the event upsets the most careful calculations and frustrates the wisest plans. The moon was now shining with extraordinary brilliance, and the fog, far from veiling its lustre, seemed to make it more disconcerting. Persons assumed strange forms, and the shapes of things were modified or exaggerated. Our dazzled eyes were mocked by depressing hallucinations. The smallest objects took on alarming proportions, and whenever a slight breeze stirred the foliage of the beetroot field in front of us, we imagined we saw a line of snipers advancing. I had great difficulty in preventing my men from firing. It was necessary to eke out our cartridges with the utmost care, for, owing to some mistake in the transmission of orders, our supplies had not been replenished since the day before, and we had used a great many in the fighting around Bixschoote. A like prudence was not, however, observed all along the line, for every now and then the trenches would be suddenly illuminated at a point where for a few seconds a useless volley would ring out. Then everything relapsed into darkness and immobility. Towards Steenstraat, too, the firing seemed to be dying down. I looked at my watch. It was 6:30. This was the hour when, as a rule, our men began to feel hungry, and when in each troop the chasseurs would set out, pannikin in hand, towards the smoking saucepan where the cook awaited them, wielding his ladle with an important air. But on this particular evening no one thought of eating. We seemed all to feel that our work was not yet over, and that we still had a weighty task on hand. It was certainly not the moment to light fires and to make soup. No doubt the Prussians were brewing something for us of a different kind, and it would never do not to return their compliments promptly. Ready? Yes, we were ready. I turned and looked back into the trench. All my brave fellows were standing, their eyes turned to me, and seemed bent on divining by my attitude or gestures any new effort I might be about to ask of them. The pale light of the moonbeam struck full on their faces, leaving their bodies surrounded in the darkness of the trench. What a strange and comforting spectacle it was! In every eye I read calm courage and absolute confidence. Whenever I feel weary or depressed, inclined to curse the slowness of our advance and the thousand miseries of war, I need only do what I did that evening. I need only turn to my chasseurs and look into their eyes without a word. There I read so many noble and touching things that I am ashamed to have felt a momentary weakness. They do not ask the why and the wherefore of things. They live from day to day, weighed down by hard work. To them the actual fighting is a rest and a delight. As soon as it is over, they have to resume the hard life of cavalrymen on active service, spend all their time looking after their horses, fetching rations and forage, often from a considerable distance, cleaning harness and arms, and every night contriving some sort of quarters for themselves and their beasts in the squalor of the half-destroyed or abandoned villages. Quarters they must leave on the morrow. Yet nothing seems to depress them. They preserve all of the eagerness of the first few days and that imperishable French gaiety which is an additional weapon for our troops. That evening I felt them vibrating in unison with me more keenly than ever. There was little doubt that I should have to appeal to their courage again presently, for something unusual was happening in front of us. It was maddening